Good morning, everybody. Adam and I were sitting here talking, and I just looked down at the clock and realized it was 7:31. So sorry we're a little bit late. Thanks for joining us this morning on Ask the Agronomist. I'm Lance Tarchioni, technical agronomist for DeKalb Asgrow in West Central Illinois. Behind me on the board here, my phone number and my email address. So if you've got suggestions, questions, comments, complaints, please send those in. Thanks to Yetter Manufacturing here in Macomb for use of their facility again. It's kind of nice to be back here at Yetter. We haven't been here for, gosh, it's been a long time, Adam, since we've been from here. It's been a long time since I've had you for a broadcast. So nice to have you back as well. So we've been limping along with offsite locations and fill-in producers, and we've got Adam back. So that will improve the content and quality for today immensely. My plans for today are to talk a lot about what we're seeing in the fields, especially, with the condition of the corn crop. Been a lot of questions from people coming in about, why is my corn so dry? Why is my corn so dead? Why is my corn going down? Why is my corn yielding 60 to 80 bushels less than my, early dent yield checks that I did? Been a lot of talk about this. You can't pick up any farm publication or any go online anywhere and not see some agronomist talking about what's going on with the corn crop. And I don't know that I have a lot new to add, frankly, to what you maybe have heard from others, but we'll spend some time talking about that. As always, would greatly prefer to answer your questions. So if you've got questions, please chat them in. So reminder of how to do that. If you are logged into YouTube Live with either your YouTube account or just a Gmail account, you can live chat in questions, and Adam will be watching for those. And we always move the live chat questions to the top of the queue. If that doesn't work for you, some of our FSRs are watching the broadcast, so you might be able to text a question to your FSR. You're always welcome to text a question to me, but I generally am not able to monitor my phone during the broadcast, so I may not see those questions until after the fact. But this video will be recorded here, as all are the previous Ask the Agronomist. We always encourage live participation, but if you're not able to join us live, you can still take the videos in after the fact, because they'll be here on our YouTube site. So anyway, with that, I think I'll just jump right into the elephant in the room, and that's what's going on with the corn crop. So you've probably heard people talking about tar spot. You've probably heard people talking about crown rot. You've probably heard people talking about fungicide. You've probably heard people talking about genetics. There's been a lot of conversation about a lot of things. I think as always, there will be people that have different interpretations of what's going on. There are people that will misinterpret what's going on. There'll be good information. There'll be less good information. And you'll have to sort through all that and decide who you want to trust and who you want to believe and how you want to move forward for your plan for 2022. But I would say, just speaking very, very, very generally, there's a lot of areas in the state that have been somewhere between majorly and somewhat disappointed in their corn yields. There are places in the state where the corn is every bit as good as anybody could have ever dreamed it would be. Now, I personally think the yield projection for Illinois, I think it was at 214, which would have been a new record yield for Illinois. I don't really think that's in play anymore. This crop did not finish well enough to, I think, achieve a statewide yield average of 214. But there is 300 plus bushel corn in the state. There are some very, very, very strong areas. There are some very disappointing areas, and there's everything in between. I would say this Illinois crop is probably as variable as any crop I've ever seen, and even locally, the yield variations are probably the biggest that I can recall seeing. That's generally being driven by disease and the level of management that you put in place to try to manage those diseases. Now, we didn't necessarily know ahead of time how critical this aggressive disease management was going to be this year, but if you were either fortunate enough to be in an area that isn't suffering from these diseases as heavily, and we'll talk about what those are in a minute, or you just had the foresight or were an aggressive enough manager that you chose to be very aggressive with your fungicide management program, that's going to pay huge dividends with some of the challenges that we're seeing in corn this year. So, we'll talk about, things that range all the way from no fungicide application to there were acres that got fungicide 3 times this past year. And each one of those applications is adding significant bushels. There will be some people that probably think this is an exaggeration or don't believe me when I say this, but I do think there are some extreme situations out there where if you'd have done things just right by luck, you could have added 100 bushels to the yield of your corn with 3 applications of fungicide. Now, looking back and in foresight, nobody was recommending 3 applications of fungicide last year. There were people that did it just playing around, and they're going to be very thankful that they did it. And I think there's people that will observe things this year that they're going to now plan to do next year what they saw work really well this year. But every year is different, and this is a very unique environment. I can't really recall a crop that died like the 2021 corn crop has, and that premature death. Most of this crop did not make it to what I'll call true black layer. That's why we've got guys harvesting 14% corn out of the field middle of September. If your corn's not that dry, if you've got 25% corn, that probably means you've got some pretty good corn. Generally speaking, as long as the ear set and kernel set was good, as long as the ear count's good, if you've got crop that's still got moisture in it, I think you'll be pretty pleasantly surprised with how good that crop is. The stuff that the longer it lived, the better it's going to be this year would be kind of a general statement. Now, if it lived longer only because it was fuller season and it was green a week longer because it was fuller season, but it still died 3 weeks before black layer, it's not going to be any better just because it was green a week longer. If the only reason it was green a week longer is it was 3 or 4 days later in maturity. So we definitely could see, and I think there may be a trend where full season hybrids may have an advantage this year, but the full season hybrids and the late planted corn definitely stayed greener longer, but it was also less mature. So when you're looking at greenness, you have to assess, okay, green is good, but for example, I was looking at a late planted plot at Monmouth 2 days ago where we planted 120-day corn on June, I think it was 5th. And it's still the greenest thing in the plot, but it needs to be because it's also the furthest thing from black layer. So the early stuff died really early. The early planted stuff died really early. There's a lot of factors involved in that, and we'll discuss those a little bit more detail. But generally speaking, anytime you have premature death of a corn plant, that means it's been under a lot of stress. And before that plant dies, in its last ditch effort to make the best of a bad situation, it's going to heavily cannibalize itself. And so the stalk quality is probably the worst that I've seen in 20 years. I remember a year, I believe it was 2001, where before harvest was over, we all had a reel on, and there were some fields that ended up being unharvestable that year because it literally, the stalk disintegrated to the point where you really couldn't pull it into the head. Root balls were falling out of the ground. You're getting the whole plant, root ball and everything coming into the head. Everybody had a reel on, and even with reels, there were some fields that literally just got abandoned. And I don't, Cal and I get accused of being too negative sometimes when we talk about this crop, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to get this crop out of the field. We're on a record pace with harvest. We started a week ago on my farm at home, and we should have started a week before that. People who haven't started yet scare me, frankly, because when they get out there, they're going to discover that there's really not much holding these plants up. We had I'll call it a moderate wind event 2 or 3 nights ago in West Central Illinois. And by moderate, I'm going to say probably 40, 45 mile an hour gusts. I mean, it was not that big of a deal, and it flattened some fields. And there is down corn in every field where there was a 40 mile an hour wind that went through. So Thankfully, there are a lot of acres of soybeans that are not ready to cut yet. Thankfully, the extended forecast looks pretty uneventful. So if we can get a couple weeks of good quality corn harvest in here before we have to spend a lot of time cutting beans, and I'll make a statement that will offend my soybean guru friends, and no disrespect to the soybean crop, but to be honest, on my farm, I ain't cutting a bean till my corn is done, and the beans are going to have to wait, and that could prove to be a disastrous decision. 2 years ago, I was cutting beans in the snow because I left some beans till November, and then the weather conditions turned, and it was a really, really, really tough late fall for soybean harvest. Now, in defense of that decision, I will make the argument that picking down corn up does not work in the snow either. So I really think the lesser of two evils is to let the beans wait and let's get the corn crop out. If you're raising seed beans, can't do that because you got to have a quality product. If you're just raising commodity beans, I would let those go. So, you'll have to make that decision on your own farm, but that's what we're doing on my farm. And if you cut your beans timely and your corn doesn't go down, that's going to look smart. If you cut your beans timely and during the process your corn goes down, then that's probably going to be a little bit of a painful situation. So you can argue that both ways. There's pros and cons both ways. There is no good solution when every acre you have needs harvested now. Something's going to have to wait, and you'll just have to make that decision. If you've got, good stock quality in your corn, so if you can go out there and do some push tests, do some kick tests, do some pinch tests, and you're finding that stock is not a hollow piece of paper, then that crop's probably okay to let it wait and go do some beans. But if every field of corn you walk into looks like most of the fields that I spend my days walking through, and that is there's literally not much holding that plant up. It's to the point where it can barely hold itself up, let alone any sort of wind or rain event that might come along. Most people who walk in a cornfield come out of that cornfield with the reaction of, oh boy, I need to get this harvested now. And if you haven't been in your cornfields, I would encourage you. I wouldn't waste time going out there and scouting. I'd go scout with the combine. So I had a friend of mine send me a text last night. He had hand shelled some corn, and he's in a part of the state. He's in southeastern Knox County. May planted corn, so he's in an area with a lot less crown rot than some other areas of the state. He's in an area that had pretty good growing conditions through the summer, didn't have a lot of drought stress through the summer. And that May planted corn, he's got 109, 111-day hybrids that other people have at 13%. His hand shelled at 23 yesterday. So he's got a lot more health in that plant. That's a different environment, different situation. His question was, well, I hand shelled at 23. How much moisture am I going to add with the combine? I said, I don't care, just go pick it. But he didn't really like that response because he's got beans that are ready to cut. And, if your corn's healthy and mid-20s on moisture, probably okay to go cut some beans. If your corn's dead in 14, which there's a lot more of that than there is healthy in 25, I'd be careful leaving that corn in the field, I guess. So, Adam, I've been talking a lot here. I don't know if I don't know that any live questions have come in, but I'm sure you've got some stuff you want to make sure we cover today. And I want to get into the specifics of what is crown rot, what causes it, what's going on, how does that interact with tar spot, how does that interact with southern rust, what is this, just hodgepodge of diseases, cesspool of diseases, some people have referred to it as, that we've got going on out there, and how do those things interact? But I guess I'll open it up for a question first.
Well, right at the moment, we don't have any questions, but I think that's kind of where I want to go with it today. And I think we got to look at the season as a whole and how those different fungicides interact with the growth and development of the crop throughout the season.
Fungi rather than fungicides, probably.
I'm sorry, how those fungi or those fungi, depending on how you pronounce it.
They're not much fun, but yes.
Yeah, very little fun. But I think, like you said, Lance, we're seeing, I would say, some of the most remarkable responses to fungicide application throughout different timings of the year.
Right.
than we've ever seen before. And obviously that's because of the interaction with these different fungi,
Right.
And when they infect, how they infect, when they
Right.
come on.
Right.
And of course, we had a stressful season overall in a lot of ways. In the first half of the season and the second half of the season, I kind of look at based on when flowering happens. So I call everything vegetatively that's
Right.
growing, basically the first half, and after that, reproductive stages I call the second half. And in conjunction with the different disease pressure that we need to get into and talk about, like you alluded to, I think we also need to take into consideration, where do all the nutrients that we get in the kernel and that we harvest, where do they all come from? When do they all accumulate? Because there's a lot of those nutrients that get accumulated early in the vegetative growth period. And we didn't have the greatest vegetative growth period in all conditions this year.
Right.
So, I think the combination of all the disease pressure that we had, the combination of we really didn't put as much in the tank, in my opinion, in certain locations or certain environments, we didn't put as much sink in that stock that we could remobilize to later. And I think when we did remobilize it in combination with all those diseases,
Right.
Man, corn plant just threw it all in and did what it could do at the last minute. So
the sugars that we accumulate in a plant through photosynthesis, and we've talked about sunlight a lot this year, and how many days we didn't really have quality sunlight, and how much of a factor is that. But the sugars that is produced by photosynthesis that's stored in the plant that converts that to starch, that's what makes the kernel. That's the process Adam was talking about. Having a plant that is loaded with sugar and has stored up a lot of sugar makes it naturally resistant to a lot of different infections. And as those sugar levels are depleted in that plant, and if you ever want to test that, by the way, go out there early July after flowering and strip the ear off. Don't damage the plant in any other way. Just take the ear off and watch that plant through the rest of the growing season. That will be the greenest, cleanest, disease-free, beautiful stalk, green till probably Thanksgiving or until we get a good freeze plant in the whole field. That's because it's got nowhere to go with all that sugar that it's making, and it stores it up in the stalk. And if you're storing those sugars, you're pretty naturally resistant to infection from a lot of different pathogens. Well, as you start to deplete yourself going through that cannibalization process, because as Adam pointed out, you're not making as much as you need to fill the ear. You got to find it from somewhere. So if you've got some extra, wasn't really extra, but the plant's going to act like it's extra, stored up in the stalk, stored up in the plant tissue, you start remobilizing those sugars out of that tissue. And as you start to deplete the sugars in that tissue, it becomes susceptible to everything. And even hybrids that are known to be pretty resistant to different diseases are very susceptible to diseases in that depleted, weakened state. And so the combination of perfect environment for a lot of disease development, for multiple diseases to develop. So we don't have just one nasty corn disease. We've got about 3 or 4 in almost every field. The fields that only have one nasty corn disease, pretty good corn. The fields that have 4 nasty corn diseases is where the train wrecks are. But combination of the pathogen, the perfect environment for the pathogen, a weakened, depleted plant, and all those stress factors is really what happened to us. And the reason you're coming up so short of where your yield checks were coming in, what factor were you using for kernel count to make a bushel when you were doing your yield checks? Historically, the formulas all use 90,000. Well, we got tired of always underestimating yield using 90,000. So people start getting cute with the formula. There were recommendations to use 76, 80. 85 is now considered to be conservative. We always used to use 90. Well, if you want to double check, well, how good were my yield checks? If you go back and look up those yield checks, whatever factor you used, change that factor to 95 or 100. And in some cases, the kernel weight is so light, it's taking 100,000 or more kernels to give you 56 pounds of grain. And if you're trying to figure out where'd all the corn go, if you change from the factor that you used back in whenever it was, you did that yield check, redo that calculation. Don't change anything. Just change the formula to 95 or 100 instead of whatever you used. And you'll see about an 80 or 100 bushel swing in yield. And so that's how 260 turned into 160, and you're left going, what the hell? A lot of these fields that died prematurely, the worst ones, I'm going to say died about quarter milk. They died about when you'd be chopping silage. So the premature death was very early. That's how you have corn at 14% middle of September. It has to die early. This year also proves something I've always said, that corn that dies early dries down just fine. People worry about corn not drying down. Well, when you're dead in August and it's 90 degrees and the wind's blowing, you're going to dry just fine. Now, if you die early from a freeze in November with late planted corn, different deal, because not really different deal. Dead is dead. But when you're dead when it's wet and cool, and when you die at a frozen corn plant that hadn't black layered yet, died at 40% moisture or more, and then you got to dry all the way down from that with crappy weather. A plant that's been in the process of dying from disease, probably that kernel's drier than it would have been if the plant was healthier when it died anyway. Plus, you've got all that warm weather. So the dead parts of the field are the driest parts of the field, not the wettest parts of the field. The live parts of the field are the wettest parts of the field. So I don't worry about, I get questions all the time about, well, I've heard when corn dies, it doesn't dry right. Yeah, it dries faster when it dies. So don't worry about it not drying. That's not going to be the problem. But a lot of these fields, that if you had a field that died 3 weeks before black layer, we're missing a lot of bushels there. If you had a field that died 2 weeks before black layer, it's better. If it died a week before black layer, that's better yet. If it actually made it to black layer, that's really good corn in most cases. So I think everything out there died a little early. Not everything died a lot early. And the presence of the different diseases, crown rot's a biggie. I can deal with tar spot. Now, tar spot's bad. I can deal with southern rust. Southern rust is bad. But if you've got all three, crown rot, tar spot, and southern rust, that's difficult to deal with. And that's what we threw at a lot of these plants. There's also more anthracnose than I've seen in years out there. Now, anthracnose is a component of crown rot. It is a disease that's often found in the crown rot complex. So there's, anthracnose can show up as a leaf blight early in the season. It's generally present in crown rot, and it's also a very, it's considered to be the number one stalk rot in corn as well. Causes the top dieback, causes the shiny black discoloration on the outside of the stalk, just destroys that stalk quality. But, fusarium root and crown rot is very common. Red root rot, which is a very devastating root rot pathogen that is not necessarily considered crown rot. It's kind of in its own, it's so bad it's in its own separate category. But it's generally present in the same environments where you have crown rot. So when I'm in a field that's got bad crown rot, generally I can find red root rot as well. Rhizoctonia can be a component, anthracnose can be a component, fusarium. So generally, anthracnose, rhizoc, and several different fusarium species would kind of be what I would call the crown rot complex. And if you've got crown rot in the field and you send a sample off to the lab, that's probably what they're going to diagnose it as, is crown rot complex. They're going to find 4 or 5 different pathogens, and nobody's going to really be able to tell you which specific one in your field was the first one there, was the worst one there, caused the most problem. All of those infections occur early in the season. So you may have heard before people talking about seed treatments reducing crown rot. You're thinking, it killed my plant in August. How in the hell is a seed treatment going to do anything in August? Well, they don't. But they do something, for a few weeks after planting. And those crown rot infections get started early. It's a little bit like the analogy I use is kind of like sudden death in soybeans. Sudden death, which is also a fusarium species, by the way, infects early in the season, hangs out in that soybean plant. You don't really even know it's there until grain fill, and that's when the foliar symptoms show up, and that's when the bad things start to happen. But that pathogen has been in that root system, making that root system sick, reducing the functionality of that root system season long. Same thing with crown rot in corn. These plants that die from crown rot, if we'd have been splitting those crowns open in June and July, we could have seen the brown discoloration that starts, the initial symptomology of crown rot. The plant at that stage looks great. It's beautiful. This corn crop was as pretty as any crop you'd ever seen, even though we had a lot of crown rot infections in the roots. But when you threw tar spot on top of that, and you threw southern rust on top of that, and you threw some 80-degree nights on top of that, and you threw some little periods of dryness during grain fill on top of that, and you add on top of that the yield potential this crop had, if this corn crop was headed for 180 instead of 280, there wouldn't be near as much premature death, because these plants, we had pretty good ear counts. Pollination was perfect. We had very little tip back. Things were pretty good after pollination. So if you look at these ears in these fields, the kernel depth is minuscule. The kernel weight is very, very light. But there's not a lot of tip back on these ears. Every kernel's there. These plants felt pretty good after pollination. They got through that period. They got to the point at about R3 is where kernel abortion's no longer going to occur. So after R3, the plant cannot lighten the load on itself by aborting kernels. All it can do is cannibalize itself and make the kernel smaller, which is certainly what these plants did to try to make the best of a bad situation and to produce some seed. So, and the fact, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. My colleague Jim Donnelly, who's one of our tar spot experts, Jim and I like to kind of go back and forth a little bit on, I kind of think crown rot's a bigger deal than tar spot. He would think that's crazy talk, that anything is worse than tar spot. The combination of the two is devastating. I think if we could have taken the tar spot away, the crown rot wouldn't have been as big a deal. If we could have taken the crown rot away, the tar spot wouldn't have been as big a deal. The combination of the two is devastating, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. You can argue about which one, which one's doing the most damage. And then I know, Adam, in your area, a lot of southern rust. And so you throw southern rust into the mix, and both tar spot and southern rust, very aggressive pathogens that can infect tissue very rapidly. In the case of southern rust, there is genetics that are fairly resistant to southern rust, and those hybrids generally are performing better this year. In the case of tar spot, there really aren't hybrids that are resistant to tar spot. Tar spot's a new disease. We've talked about this before. If you caught the episode of Ask the Agronomist where Jim and I sat down and discussed tar spot, probably 2019 was the first year that corn breeders in North America really paid a lot of attention to tar spot. And that was after the bad year that they experienced in Northern Illinois in 2018. Now, 2021 is making 2018 look like not that big a deal, because 2018, it was, Southern Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, maybe a little bit Northeastern Iowa. It was, not that that's not a really important place for corn production, but it wasn't covering several states. You fast forward to 2021, we've got significant tar spot infections throughout the state of Illinois, throughout the state of Indiana, throughout the state of Michigan, into Ohio, quite a bit of Iowa. So the scope and range of tar spot continues to expand, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to breed hybrids that are more resistant to that disease. We're confident that we can. We have resistance to tar spot in germplasm that's grown in other parts of the world where tar spot has been a thing for a long time. Tar spot's not new. It's relatively new to Illinois. Every year, people have it for the first time in the Midwest because they didn't realize they'd had it before. A lot of people are saying, well, it's the first time I've ever seen it in 2021. It was in most cornfields in Illinois in 2020. But you had to know what you were looking for, and you had to look for it, and it wasn't that hard to find if you looked for it. But it came in really late, didn't really affect yield. 2021, different deal. We had more inoculum around. We had the right environmental conditions. We're learning as well that the quote unquote right environmental conditions for tar spot, might be a little broader set of environmental conditions than maybe was first thought. In Mexico, it occurs in cool, wet environments at higher elevations. It wasn't particularly cool in Illinois in 2021, but we had a lot of humidity. We had a lot of cloudy days. We had a lot of low sunlight days, and we had a lot of tar spot. So I don't think it necessarily has to be cool to have, a heavy tar spot year. 2021, if we're in the middle of a hot drought, you're probably not going to see a lot of tar spot. 2021, I would say, was generally normal temperatures. People talk about how hot it was in 21. We didn't have a lot of high daytime highs. We had a lot of humidity. We had a lot of high heat indexes. We had a lot of hot nights. We didn't necessarily have, I think 92 or 93 was maybe the highest we got to during the day. I don't think we had any days over 95. So it was not a hot summer in 2021, but it was extremely humid. We did have a lot of moisture. We did have poor sunlight conditions, and those are all things that the tar spot, thrives in. We also had good conditions for southern rust, and that's another disease that it does not overwinter here. So that's the advantage that we have against southern rust. It at least has to move in every year. And if we don't get the right movement of wind currents and storm events coming up, so for southern rust to be bad here, it has to be bad in the south, which it usually is. It overwinters there, so they're going to have some level of southern rust every year. But if it's bad in the south and we get a storm event that brings, rust spores up through, Illinois or Iowa or, wherever that storm track goes, that's how we get southern rust every year. That's why it tends to come in a little later, because it doesn't start here. It starts in the south, has to move up here. But this year it got here in time to do some damage, and hybrids that are susceptible to southern rust that did not get protection from a fungicide, that's just one more additional stress on that plant. And the way these diseases, tar spot is maybe a little bit different, because, tar spot, you reach a certain level of infection on that leaf and the leaf just dies. And there's more research that needs to be done on actually how is it doing that, because the leaf is not covered with lesions, but yet long before the leaf is covered with lesions, the leaf just prematurely senesces and dies. And I'd never seen that before this year. Jim Donnelly has seen that for years, working with tar spot in northern Illinois. And you get to gray leaf spot doesn't work that way. The way gray leaf spot kills a leaf is by completely covering the leaf with lesions. And if a little speck of that leaf doesn't have a lesion, it's still green. Tar spot's different. You reach a certain level of infection on that leaf, and the plant almost, to me, looks like it kind of sacrifices that leaf, and that you lose the whole leaf, even though the whole leaf was never covered with lesions. So southern rust doesn't exactly work that way, but it can destroy a lot of leaf area as well. And the destruction of leaf area by tar spot and southern rust was a major factor in how devastating, crown rot ended up being. So if you had unhealthy roots, you had plants that were under stress, you had plants that were struggling to find the moisture and nutrients that they needed to finish the year because they had unhealthy roots. You add on top of that a loss of leaf area due to tar spot and southern rust, and then you throw in some hot nights, you throw in some dry weather, and it's just a vicious cycle. The plant is under severe stress because it has unhealthy roots. It's feeling more drought stress than you realize because it's got unhealthy roots. It's not that dry, but if your roots aren't healthy, it feels drier than it is to that corn plant. And so even though we were not ever really, really super dry, when it got just a little bit dry, that plant could feel that drought stress more than we realized because those roots were not healthy. And then it's just a vicious cycle that takes that plant down. And that's how that plant goes from green to off green to silver to brown in about 4 days. And we call that ghosting, when that plant just gives up the ghost and dies. And you go in a course of 4 or 5 days from a green plant with an upright ear that looks really good to a completely brown plant with the ear tipped over. That happens extremely rapidly. And the reason I think crown rot is so insidious as a disease is because, when the root's dead, it doesn't really matter how big your ear was. It doesn't matter how good your population is. It doesn't matter how healthy your leaves were. It doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put on. It doesn't even matter how much fungicide you put on. It doesn't matter what you've done prior to that. When the root's dead, game's over. And whatever dry matter you've accumulated in the kernel the day the roots died, that's all you get. And as soon as that plant's dead, all it can do is just dry up. And that's why in some areas with these disease issues, we've got corn that's yielding 80 to 100 bushel less than people were yield checking. And we've got, corn that is so light that you can't get 80,000 pounds on a semi. And I hesitate to even bring this up, Adam, because I know somebody's going to think I said that test weight matters for yield. But when corn dies early, your test weight's going to be crap. You can't have heavy corn when it dies early. But the problem with the yield is not necessarily the test weight, it's the kernel weight. But on top of the pitiful kernel weight, which is creating the pitiful yield in some cases, we also have extremely low test weights. So I've had people report test weights to me below 50 pounds. And there's potentially some people that, might suffer some docks due to test weight, which is, just adding insult to injury. So we've talked, kind of about the different diseases that are going on out there. I want to spend a little bit of time of what we've observed as far as people that have used fungicides in different ways at different timings. A question, Adam, before we go to that?
Yeah. So great synopsis there. I think, that's kind of what I was trying to allude to is high yields come from being able to produce a lot of photosynthates or a lot of sugars.
Right.
You know what I mean? Basically sugars that are derived from the photosynthetic process. That's what photosynthates are. You got a lot of them, you're producing a lot of them all year long, nothing impedes that, you get big yields. Mm-hmm. Pretty much what it all amounts to, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about the impediments of all the disease. We hit on the fact that, we didn't have the greatest growing season necessarily, especially the first half of the growing season for the corn plant, even in the absence of disease, to really accumulate as many sugars as it wants. And when you put all those things together, we've got a lot of variability out there and some challenging yields in some places that even I dare say it had an affected kernel weight and then therefore test weights too. Right. But one of the questions that we got here came from Chris Robnett. Thanks for chiming in there, Chris. He was wanting to know, with all this disease and all this pressure, all this inoculant, if you will, out in the field, should we think about doing things different or anything extra for this fall when it comes to cultural practices to try and, keep that at bay the best we can for next season?
Right. So that's kind of the $1 million question. And thanks, Chris, for trying to get us back out of the ditch and back up on the road and talking about how we're going to, because I know that's what you're doing, to manage things better for next year, hopefully. So, every year is different. And that's where I start this conversation. We don't necessarily want to do next year what we should have done this year because next year is going to be different. But I think what we've learned from this year is we need to be prepared to do certain things if tar spot gets bad. We need to be prepared to do certain things if southern rust gets bad. We probably need to take some preventative measures, in my opinion, to lessen the severity of crown rot if we can, which is tough to do. But that the crown rot issue is they're all very weather driven things, and probably if you want to go into next year loaded for bear against all of these different pathogens, that's not going to hurt the yield of your corn. That's going to benefit the yield of your corn. What that could hurt is your, the economic side of things. If you're spending money to protect yourself against a disease that you end up not having because the environment wasn't right for the disease. So that's the risk of aggressive management. The risk of aggressive management is I'm spending money I don't need to spend. And I may be less profitable because I didn't get a positive ROI on an investment I made. You could not possibly not get a positive ROI on any fungicide investment you made in this year's crop. But that's not the case every year. And we can't necessarily assume that just because we've got bad tar spot, we're going to have bad tar spot every year. We certainly can't assume that we're going to have bad southern rust every year. We don't know what the crown rot pressure is going to be every year. Adams talked about how we got off to kind of a rough start, and the early growing season wasn't great either. It was too cold. It was too wet. We had a lot of wet, saturated soil conditions. We had some nitrogen loss. We had probably issues with nutrient uptake, and there was just a lot of stuff going on below the soil. That plant was struggling a lot more than we realized, and that soil environment was perfect for all those pathogens to infect those corn roots. So if we could have changed, and frankly, if you travel around the state to places where corn is phenomenally good, they generally had different spring conditions than what we did here in West Central Illinois, or they've got different soils, or they've got different, there's differences to explain, why this guy's got 300 bushel corn and this guy would like to get to 160. So there's differences in environment that drive all these things. But generally speaking, what we have seen is, an early season fungicide application, and I'm going to call early season that V5-ish timing, in our crown rot trials has been the most effective treatment that we've had for reducing the incidence of crown rot. There is nothing, in my opinion, that you can do. There is no hybrid you can plant. There is no product you can buy that is going to control completely crown rot and guarantee you're not going to have an issue with crown rot. But there are things. We've looked at a lot of in-furrow fungicide products. We've looked at in-furrow biological products. We've looked at the V5 fungicide applications, and consistently that V5 application is doing more than anything we have tested in furrow. Now, that doesn't mean that the in-furrow products don't have a benefit. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't use them. If you've got a planter that has a system that allows them the investment in that equipment to be able to make those applications is justified, I would encourage you to do that. I wouldn't do that in place of a V5 fungicide. I do that in addition to a V5 fungicide. And so far, what we have looked at, I don't know that I've seen a product that makes me want to run out and put a liquid system on my planter just so I can use that product. But if you've got a liquid system on your planter, there are products that I would be adding to that system to help protect you from crown rot. The other thing I really want to play around with from a research perspective, I would love to set up an old style banded nozzle setup where you've got one nozzle in the middle and two shooting in from each side right over the top of the row on 30-inch centers. And the problem with the V5 fungicide application is we got to put enough on, a high enough concentration on to get enough in the plant. The amount it needs at that stage, because it's not very big, isn't real high, and that's why it's okay that 80% of it's falling on the soil. But if we could just spray the plant, I'd love to play around with, some different rates, and, if we could direct that spray just over the plant. I know all my retail friends are really upset with me right now because they're not going to build a sprayer to do that. But if I was a small farmer and had the time, I would love to play around with that and see what sort of impact we could have on that plant if we could kind of post direct some fungicide at and there might even be a benefit. We don't really recommend spraying V3, V4 corn because it's too small to catch enough of the product, and it's kind of inefficient, and most of it's landing on the soil. But if we could just spray it direct it towards the plant, we might find that putting fungicide on V2 corn is a good idea. So I think there's work that can be done there. We also learned this year that rates definitely matter with fungicides. So all fungicides have a range of rates on their label. Generally, with those V5 applications, people are using something close to half a rate normally. Half of a standard use rate. So in the case of Delaro, a lot of people that spray Delaro at V5 would spray 4 ounces at V5. I had a producer that had a huge response from using 6 ounces of Delaro at V5. I've seen big responses from 4, but in the environment we had this year, 6 is probably better than 4, 8's probably better than 6. Same thing with the VT applications that come later in the season. The standard use rate of any fungicide is not the highest rate on the label. And generally speaking, most people use the standard use rate. So in the case of Delaro Complete, that would be 8 ounces. The max label rate's 12. And if you're trying to control things as aggressive as tar spot and southern rust, 12 is better than 8. So people have worked with, using higher rates. The higher rates give you longer residual. The higher rates give you a higher level of control. It's hard to swallow the price tag of some of those higher rates in a year where we don't have super heavy disease pressure. But after living through 21 and seeing what heavy disease pressure can do to corn, I think there are people that are going to be asking about, well, would more be better? And in the case of tar spot, more definitely is better when you're talking about both fungicide rate and also the frequency of application. So we're going to set up that early season. If you want to do something about crown rot, look at something in furrow, look at a V5 fungicide, play around with the rates on that V5 fungicide. And then as we go later in season, that tassel time or VT application, just to give us a good base level of protection against tar spot, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, all the other stuff that's out there every year is a really good place to start. And then what we learned in 2021, unfortunately, when Mother Nature gives us just the right environment to make these diseases bad, and we've got multiple diseases that are bad, a second application post-tassel is going to pay dividends. And there were some producers that went out really late this year with actually it was an early dent stage, in most cases, application of a second fungicide application after tassel. And even those applications that late have been adding about 20 bushel to corn. Now, I wouldn't count on that year in and year out. I think that's a factor of the extreme things that we were seeing this year, but I think a lot of fields would have benefited from a second application, maybe 3 weeks after the first application. I also think that there would be a benefit to getting that first application on earlier than a lot of people did this year. So I'm a big tassel timing guy. I want that fungicide in that plant when that tassel's visible. I don't want to wait for silks. I don't want to wait for pollination. I don't want to wait for brown silk. I don't want to see any brown. I want to see tassel. I want to go spray. And then we need to watch and see how the season progresses. And unfortunately, what we've learned in 2021, there's probably situations where a second application after tassel is going to make your corn a lot better. That first one is going to do a lot of good. I think it'll do more good than the second one does. So the first one's the most important one to make, but there are situations where that second shot would pay. Now, does everybody need to plan on spraying fungicide in corn 3 times next year? No, I don't think so. There are people who will, and if you're one of those people, that's great. See what you think, look at different products, different timings, different rates. There's probably going to be people that wonder, well, how would 8 ounces twice compare to 12 ounces once? Or how does, this product compare to that product? And there are differences in products. The thing we're learning with tar spot is tar spot's different than any other disease that we deal with, foliar disease anyway, that we deal with currently. In that there is very little resistance in the plant. So we are relying almost 100% on the fungicide to control the disease. With every other disease, the plant is already somewhat tolerant, in some cases pretty highly resistant to the disease. And so all the fungicide has to do is help the plant. In the case of tar spot, the plant can't help itself much. And so the fungicide is doing all the work. And so we are seeing differences in products. We are seeing differences in applications. We are seeing differences in rates. We are seeing things that we've never seen out of fungicides before, because typically if the fungicide's working kind of okay, things are good. In the case of tar spot, if the fungicide's just working kind of okay, that's not going to be that good. So we're seeing things this year in fungicides that we haven't seen in the past. And I don't think anything's really different other than the fact we have the presence of a disease that requires good fungicide efficacy. We haven't necessarily had that in the past because, like I say, the plant is pretty resistant to the disease already, and all the fungicide is doing is kind of helping it out. Or we've talked before a lot about the plant health benefits of the strobilurin fungicides, the good things, stress relieving properties that strobe fungicides do for the plant that doesn't even have anything to do with disease control. So in a normal year in central Illinois, I would have said we get more yield increase from a fungicide from plant health than we do from disease control. But that's not the case in 21. In 21, disease control is critical to getting you closer to your maximum yield. Now, I'll say this too. I think you could have sprayed fungicide 3 times in 21 at the perfect timing at a good rate with the right product and still lost yield. So these diseases cannot be eliminated. We're just going to try to manage them. So as you look ahead into 22, recognize that, hybrid selection can have a big impact on southern rust. It can have a small impact on tar spot and crown rot. But in the case of crown rot and tar spot, fungicides are going to be your best line of defense. With southern rust, you can sort through a seed guide and select hybrids that are pretty resistant to southern rust. That doesn't mean they won't benefit from a fungicide application. You can also find hybrids that have better tolerance to tar spot, but you can't find a hybrid that doesn't need sprayed to protect it from tar spot. So, the differences between products on some of the diseases are more subtle. And so we kind of treat them all more or less the same. With things like northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, southern rust that we've been breeding for a long time, there are bigger differences between products. You can buy good hybrids that are highly susceptible to southern rust, and you're going to have to manage southern rust with a fungicide. Using those hybrids doesn't bother me because I'm going to be using the fungicide anyway. So, you could argue that, well, if you're going to spray fungicide anyway, does it really hurt to plant a product that's susceptible to a disease if you're willing to control that disease with a fungicide? If you're not willing to control that disease with a fungicide, then you damn well better plant a hybrid that's resistant to that particular disease just in case it's bad. So, Chris, I don't know if that answers all your questions for 22 or not. We don't have all the answers, to be quite honest with you. There's more work that needs to be done. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. We've got producers that historically don't use fungicide at all. We've got producers that use fungicide every year. Nobody has, on a routine basis, unless it's like a high yield contest or something, been spraying fungicide 3 times during a growing season. But I think there will be some producers that next year do that on some acres just to see what that looks like. Question, Adam?
Yeah, I guess just to kind of add to it, I mean, as I read Chris's questions a little bit more, is there anything we need to be thinking about in addition to what you're talking about for next season? Is there anything this fall
so
that we should be doing?
Like tillage or,
Right.
Yep. So,
Right.
So in the case of crown rot, it's a very easy thing to answer because there's not much you can do there's nothing you can do from a residue standpoint that's going to impact crown rot. The only thing you could do that would maybe impact crown rot would be to improve your drainage. So, we like to put in tile in Illinois. We have a lot of acres that will benefit from tile. Improving your drainage can lessen the likelihood that the soil environment is right for the infection of crown rot. Outside of that, no, not much you can do. In the case of southern rust, it doesn't overwinter here. So the fact that your residue is full of southern rust is a moot point because those spores are going to die. And next year, we're going to get a new batch of spores blowing in from down south. Tar spot does overwinter here. So in the case of tar spot, wood aggressive tillage, vertical tillage isn't going to do any good, but wood aggressive tillage where you physically bury the residue, would it help? And I would say technically yes, if everybody did it. But we are not going to recommend everybody's rip every acre and get the moldboard plow back out and bury all this tar spot infected residue. There seems to be some evidence that tar spot might be overwintering on 2-year-old corn residue as well. So if we all had tar spot in 20 also. It wasn't as bad as it was in 21. But if you're going into first year corn in 22 that was beans this year, there's still corn residue, in a no-till situation or a reduced till situation, still 2-year-old corn residue out there. Can tar spot overwinter on that? Possibly. It's certainly going to overwinter on the fresh corn residue from this past year. It's a very mobile, once those spores start to form, it's a pretty mobile disease. So it moves around, it blows around, it's moving with the wind currents. And what you do in your field can influence it to a certain extent. But even if you buried every spore that was in your field and buried every infected piece of residue that was in your field, if the fields surrounding your field are full of tar spot, you're going to have plenty of exposure to tar spot as well. So for that reason, I don't necessarily consider tillage to be an effective means of control. If you like to do tillage, you can still do tillage. If you would prefer not to do tillage, I don't think you're hurting yourself from a tar spot perspective by not doing tillage. So I would say, as far as, things that we need to do this fall differently to help protect ourselves against these problems next year, I would say there's not a lot that I would recommend to do differently. I think the things we do differently will be things we do in season next year, more so than things that we do getting ready for next year.
Jordan Zimmer got a question in
All right,
here.
thank you, Jordan.
Says, have you seen a difference in harvest moisture between corn that had 28% versus corn that had anhydrous?
Good question. So if there's a difference in harvest moisture, I think that relates more to the health of the plant and the disease load than it does to the fertilizer application. So if one form of fertilizer or the other meant that plant had more nitrogen available to it at the right time during the growing season, that it was able to maintain health and be in better shape, if it was less nutrient stressed, that corn might be wetter because it may have been healthier. And if it was healthier, it may have lived a little longer, so it might be wetter. I don't personally think there's any difference normally in, corn plant doesn't really care what type of nitrogen you apply. What it cares is it can find what it needs the day that it needs it. You could use urea, you could use UAN, you could use anhydrous, you could use some combination of all the above. As long as there's enough there available for the plant doesn't care. But sometimes there are differences in the amount of available nutrient based on how and when it was applied. And I do think that there are situations out there this year where plant health and crop yield was even worse due to a nutrient issue that was going on during the growing season. This kind of goes back to Adam's point about, was the plant able to find all the resources it needed to make as many photosynthates as it could, produce as much sugar as it could. And if it was lacking in something, that was just an additional stress on top of the crown rot, on top of the southern rust, on top of the low light, on top of the tar spot, on top of everything else we've discussed. So you could have inadvertently made a bad situation worse if that corn hybrid was starved for, sulfur, potassium, nitrogen. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are differences that you're seeing in harvest moisture and maybe yield from different nitrogen programs, if one program favored, having more nitrogen there the day that the plant wanted more nitrogen.
Yeah. All right. Well,
anything else, Adam, that's come in? I think we're probably close to time.
No, we're getting ready to wrap it up. We haven't had any more questions come in. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jordan, for the questions today. We always appreciate that. We like that type of conversation. We're going to be back on October 7th, which will be 2 weeks from today, with Ask the
That'll be
Agronomist
after
again.
corn harvest for some people.
Yeah. Let's hope. Mother Nature doesn't pause it. We could keep rocking and rolling with harvest. Again, I'm with Lance. I really encourage everybody to try and get as much of that corn out there harvested as quick as you can. If you've got some corn that's in better shape or worse shape, and I think a lot of it's in the worse shape category than the better shape as far as standability and having a mess. So thanks again for all your questions. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to know when the next Ask the Agronomist is coming up. Your phone will notify you if you set it up right so that you don't have to remember October 7th. And be sure to reach out to your reps or Lance or anybody if you got any questions. We'll try to address it on the next Ask the Agronomist.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And please be safe. Harvest time is a very dangerous time of the year. And as I was in the combine yesterday fighting down corn. I was out of the combine several times, throwing stuff in the corn head after I turned it off. And days get long, you get frustrated. It's just, a difficult environment. We've had some combine fires already this year with how dry conditions have been. We got some rain here a few days ago that, kind of helped reduce that fire potential for a little while. But just, remember that no matter what else is going on, getting home safe in one piece to your family at night's the most important thing we do every day. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you.